In a packed lecture hall at Stanford University, Professor Daniel Warren, a well-known atheist and philosophy professor, prepared to challenge religious beliefs once again. Infamous for his sharp logic and dramatic teaching style, Warren thrived on dismantling faith in front of his students. That day's topic, the fallacy of faith, why religion persists despite scientific advancements. As he paced the stage, he posed a familiar question. If a loving God exists, why does he allow suffering? Some students chuckled, others nodded, but one remained unfazed. Barron, a quiet but composed student, who would soon turn the debate in an unexpected direction. Professor Warren stood at the front of the lecture hall, his posture relaxed but commanding. He thrived in these moments, when he could challenge deeply held beliefs and force students to question what they thought they knew. That day's topic was one of his favorites. The fallacy of faith. Why religion persists in an age of reason? Pacing the stage, Warren gestured broadly as he spoke. We live in the 21st century, he declared, his voice laced with amusement. We have science, medicine, space travel, yet millions still believe in an invisible cosmic father figure watching over them. A few students chuckled, others nodded in agreement. Some, however, stared at their desks, avoiding eye contact, as if bracing for what was coming. Warren thrived on this dynamic. He wasn't just a professor, he was a performer. His lectures felt like courtroom dramas, with faith always cast as the defendant. His arguments were sharp, calculated, and nearly impossible to counter. Over the years, many religious students had tried, only to find themselves overwhelmed by his cold, precise logic. But the real question, Warren continued, pausing for effect, is why bad things happen. His gaze swept the room, finally landing on a student near the back. Barron, he called out. The room grew quiet. Everyone knew what was coming next. Barron wasn't the type to stand out. He was tall but lean, rarely speaking unless directly addressed. Unlike the other students who had crumbled under Warren's scrutiny in the past, Barron never seemed nervous. His dark eyes remained steady, his expression unreadable. You're a believer, aren't you? Warren asked, his tone dripping with mock curiosity. I am, Barron replied evenly. The professor smirked. Fascinating. Maybe you can help me understand something. If Jesus is real, why do bad things happen? Why hasn't he proven himself? A few students shifted in their seats. This was Warren's favorite trap, the problem of suffering. He had used variations of this argument countless times before, and the responses were always predictable: stuttering, circular reasoning, desperate appeals to faith. But Barron didn't respond as expected. He didn't fumble for a verse or quote scripture. He simply sat there, unshaken, staring back at Warren. The room felt different. For the first time in one of Warren's debates, the silence wasn't a sign of defeat. It was the beginning of something unexpected. The room was silent as Barron sat still, his expression calm and unreadable. Unlike past students who had stumbled over their words, scrambling for a defense, he didn't rush to answer. He didn't fumble through scripture or resort to vague appeals to faith. He simply waited, his dark eyes locked onto Warren's. The professor tapped his fingers on the podium. No answer? He said, his smirk widening. A few chuckles rippled through the room. The tension thickened as Barron finally leaned forward, resting his forearms on his desk. His voice was even, steady. I never said I didn't have an answer, Barron replied. I just don't think you're asking the right question. Warren's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, so quickly that most wouldn't have noticed. But Barron did. The professor tilted his head. Oh? Enlighten me. Barron didn't react to the sarcasm. Instead, he took a slow breath and spoke. You keep asking why God lets bad things happen, but let's be real. What you're actually asking is why doesn't he stop them? Why doesn't he step in, take control, and fix the world for us? Warren clapped his hands together. Exactly. Now we're getting somewhere. He pointed at Barron, eyes gleaming with challenge. Let's say I'm on a train track, and a train is coming right at me. You see me. You have the power to stop it, but you don't. What does that make you? Barron tilted his head slightly. Are you saying we're all tied to train tracks? More laughter. Warren smirked again, thinking he had regained control. But Barron kept going. "You're using a loaded scenario," he said. "If you see someone about to get hit by a train, stopping them is obviously the moral choice, because they're powerless to stop it themselves. But life isn't that simple, is it? People have free will. If God intervened in everything, we wouldn't have free will. We'd be puppets." Warren shook his head unimpressed. "Ah, free will. The classic escape route." Barron exhaled slightly, almost as if he had expected this response. Then instead of continuing to defend, he shifted the focus. "You keep asking why God allows suffering," he said, voice calm, deliberate. "But let's flip the question. Why does anything good happen at all? Why do people love? Why do they forgive? Why do they sacrifice for others?" The room was quiet now. Warren, for the first time, hesitated. Barron had just changed the debate entirely. Barron's question lingered in the air, shifting the conversation in an unexpected direction. The usual rhythm of Warren's debates had been interrupted. His carefully laid trap wasn't springing the way it usually did. He narrowed his eyes, arms crossed, as he considered Barron's words. "You're saying," Warren began, "that if God stopped suffering, we wouldn't have free will? That he lets terrible things happen so we can have choices?" He let out a dry chuckle. "That's the classic escape route." Barron remained unshaken. "It's not an escape route. It's reality," he replied. "If God intervened in everything, what would be left of human agency? If every bad decision, every painful consequence was erased, what would we actually learn? Wouldn't we just be puppets, incapable of real choice?" Warren scoffed, shaking his head. "Ah, yes, free will. The grand excuse for divine negligence." A few students chuckled, but others hesitated, sensing that Barron wasn't rattled. "Let's follow that logic then," Warren continued. "If a child gets sick and dies, is that just free will? If a man loses his wife in an accident, should he just shrug and say, 'Oh, well, God didn't want to interfere'?" Barron exhaled, almost as if he had been expecting that argument. "That's not what I said," he replied, his voice steady. "You're mixing up human choices with suffering. Some things happen because of people's decisions. Violence, injustice, greed. Other things, illness, accidents, remind us that life is fragile." Warren pounced. "Exactly, fragile, random, chaotic, just like the universe. No divine plan, just chance." Barron shook his head. "Number. Just because life has suffering doesn't mean it has no meaning." The class was quieter now. Even the students who had laughed earlier were paying closer attention. Warren, sensing the shift, changed his approach. He leaned forward, voice sharper. "Let's get to the real issue then. You say suffering is necessary for free will? But what about morality? If everything is about free will, then what makes an action right or wrong? Why does anything matter if we're just making choices?" Barron met his gaze without flinching. "That depends," he said simply. "Do you believe morality is real?" Warren smirked, ready for this argument. "Morality is a human invention," he said. "Societies create it because it benefits the group. Altruism, kindness, it's just biology." Barron studied him for a moment, then with quiet confidence he asked, "If morality is just a social construct, then was slavery moral when the majority supported it?" The room went completely silent. The weight of Barron's question settled over the room like a thick fog. Professor Warren, usually quick with a sharp rebuttal, hesitated for a fraction of a second. The students, some of whom had been chuckling along earlier, were no longer laughing. "That's not what I said," Warren finally responded, his voice a bit sharper. "But it's what your argument suggests," Barron countered without missing a beat. His tone wasn't aggressive, but steady, measured. "If morality is just something societies invent to keep order, then it means right and wrong are completely subjective. It means that at any point in history, whatever the majority believed was moral, was moral. That would mean slavery was right when most people supported it. That segregation was acceptable because it was once widely practiced. That genocide, as horrifying as it is, could be justified if enough people agreed on it." A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others looked down, deep in thought. Warren exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. You're twisting my words. Morality evolves as societies grow more enlightened. What was acceptable in the past isn't acceptable now because we've progressed. Barron nodded slightly. So morality progresses? Toward what? Warren frowned. Toward a better understanding of human rights? Toward equality? Toward... Exactly, Barron interrupted. But if morality were just a social construct, why would we feel the need to progress? What would we be progressing toward? If there's no absolute moral truth, then there's no real reason to say we were wrong before and right now. We've just changed. Yet when we look back at history, we don't just see change, we see evil. We don't just think, that was a different time. We know that things like slavery, the Holocaust, segregation, were wrong even when the majority didn't think so. Warren's expression hardened slightly. You're arguing for objective morality, one that exists outside of human influence. Barron nodded. I am, because if morality is real, if some things are truly right and some things are truly wrong, no matter what people believe, then we have to ask, where does that moral law come from? The professor opened his mouth but didn't speak. A few students exchanged glances. Some frowned, deep in thought. The debate wasn't following Warren's usual script. For the first time, it wasn't just the believer on the defensive. The room remained silent, the usual energy of Warren's debates replaced by something more thoughtful, more uncertain. Barron, still calm, leaned forward slightly and spoke with quiet conviction. You keep asking why God allows suffering, he said, but suffering isn't meaningless just because we don't like it. Hard times change us. Pain forces us to see what really matters. It teaches us to love better, to live better. Warren scoffed. So, suffering is good for us now? Barron shook his head. No, suffering is awful. Nobody wants it. But if we only judge God by whether he prevents pain, we miss the bigger picture. He paused, then continued. Look at history. The people who changed the world the most weren't the ones who had easy lives. They were the ones who suffered, who lost something, who had every reason to quit, but didn't. He let his words settle before adding, Martin Luther King Jr. suffered. Harriet Tubman suffered. Viktor Frankl survived the Holocaust. Corrie ten Boom lost her family in a concentration camp, but spent the rest of her life spreading forgiveness. These weren't people who lived pain-free lives, but their suffering led them to something greater. The class was locked in now. Even the students who had laughed earlier weren't laughing anymore. Warren, gripping the podium a little tighter, tried to shift gears. That still doesn't prove God exists, he argued. People are just resilient. They find ways to survive. Barron nodded. Exactly. But let me ask you something, Professor. Do you love anyone? Warren frowned at the unexpected question. What? Do you love anyone? Barron repeated. A family member? A friend? Anyone? Warren hesitated. His students had never seen him get personal before. Sure, he said with a small shrug. Of course. Barron leaned forward. Prove it. The professor's head tilted slightly. A few students murmured in confusion. What? Prove that you love them, Barron said. Show me love under a microscope. Put it in a test tube. Weigh it. Measure it. Define it using scientific data alone. Warren crossed his arms. That's ridiculous. Is it? Barron asked. You just admitted love exists, but you can't prove it scientifically. You can't see it. You can't hold it. The only reason you know love is real is because you experience it. The room was silent. And that's exactly why I believe in God, Barron continued. I see him in the same way we see love. Not through a microscope, but in the way it changes people. I see it in the mother who forgives the man who killed her son. I see it in the doctor who spends his life saving strangers. I see it in every person who chooses to do good, even when they don't have to. Warren's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Jessica, the sharp-minded student who had earlier nodded along to Warren's arguments, blinked down at her notebook, her pen frozen in her hand. Other students sat motionless, arms crossed, deep in thought. Warren exhaled, his usual confident posture a little looser. So that's your answer? He asked, quieter now. You believe because you see good in the world? Barron nodded. I believe because I see a reason to. The bell rang, breaking the moment. But unlike other lectures, no one rushed to leave. Students lingered, some exchanging glances, others lost in thought. Barron gathered his books as if nothing had happened, his expression as calm as ever. Warren watched him, but for the first time, didn't deliver a final remark. Instead, he simply said, "I'll see you next class." It was subtle, but something had changed. Maybe not a conversion, but maybe, just maybe, a seed had been planted.